All right, so now we're going to move on to our keynote. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Ethan Nadelmann. Ethan is a widely respected drug policy reformer and advocate. He founded the Drug Policy Alliance in 2000, and he served as its director for 17 years. He's currently the host of the podcast Psychoactive. His TED Talk on drug policy in 2014 is widely watched. I think more people have seen that than have done a psychedelic in their lifetime. He's a great guy, and it's honored. Please give a warm welcome to Ethan Nadelmann.
Okay. So, Brad, I couldn't see the answers. How many people said they never had a psychedelic experience?
Not very many.
Not very many. And how many, is this the first time they've been at a psychedelics conference?
More than half.
More than half. Wonderful. Well, hello. Good morning. It's an honor to be with you. I'm delighted that Brad Dunn invited me. I'm also grateful to my former colleague at Drug Policy Alliance, Amanda Ryman, who collaborated with Brad in designing some of this agenda. So for my role here really is to put this in some broader perspective and to set the context for some of the issues you're going to be hearing talked about in much greater depth later. So I'm going to surface but also go broad on this thing. Now, I have spent virtually all of my adult life working to end the war on drugs. I started back in the late 80s when the drug war was like McCarthyism on steroids, and America was entering a period of mass arrests and mass incarcerations and incredible stigmatization and demonization. And to me, that just seemed like a horrific thing to do, not just from a public policy perspective and a human rights perspective, but a broader moral perspective, right? And so in the work I did first as a professor at Princeton and starting Drug Policy Alliance, which became the leading organization in the world working to end the war on drugs, right now, it's 26 years since we won the first medical marijuana initiative in California, Prop 215 in 1996. First time that the nascent drug policy reform movement showed that we could play ball in the big leagues of American politics. And then taking that forward on the marijuana front in terms of pushing for the decriminalization of marijuana, addressing the issues of the incredibly racially biased marijuana arrest, and then ultimately working towards a responsible system of marijuana regulation. Because as everybody here knows, when we talk about legalization, we're not talking about a free market, libertarian free-for-all. We're talking about responsible regulation. And at the same time, we understand that when some people sometimes think that prohibition represents the ultimate form of regulation, no. Prohibition represents the abdication of regulation. It means that whatever is not being effectively controlled by government or responsible parties is just out there for better and for worse, and sometimes very much for much worse. Now, in my work, I paid relatively little attention to psychedelics. They were important in my own personal life. It was a mushroom experience back in 1989 that really helped consolidate what I was going to do with my life. And there are other ways in which they've been very important to me emotionally, romantically, intellectually, even physically and such. But I didn't pay that much attention to it for a few reasons. One was that there weren't that many people going to jail for it. There were definitely people. Whether people are, following the Dead around or other concerts or other people doing this stuff or, some of the amazing chemists, Leonard Picard, who, was the biggest reportedly the biggest LSD manufacturer in history, got 2 life sentences for doing an extraordinary job at what I would basically describe as a community service, producing high-quality LSD for consumers. It was more about marijuana. It was about half of all the drug arrests around the country being for marijuana. And one of the things I'm proudest of, ultimately how this industry shakes out, I care about the marijuana industry. But for me, it wasn't about creating a legal industry. It was about ending prohibition. It was about ending the arrests. It was about ending the hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of people around the world who were getting arrested, some of them landing up in jail or prison. It was about people losing their jobs because they had failed a drug test because of what they smoked over the weekend. It was about people having their cars taken away and their property taken away, and oftentimes even having their kids taken away, not to mention, as I said before, their freedom taken away. For me, what's so wonderful, no matter how this marijuana industry ultimately shakes out, is that when my grandkids are growing up, they're going to look at me and they say, "Grandpa, you mean people used to go to jail for this stuff?" That that, as there's a newer generation emerging, and some of you are young enough that you can barely remember before the first medical marijuana initiative came. But in the same way that oftentimes people who are gay and lesbian can celebrate their freedom today and also are incredibly ignorant about the oppression and the bigotry that happened in days past, it's important to know that history and to honor that history and understand where we came from. The reason why the marijuana industry is under such pressure and deserves to be under such pressure to do things right, to do things better than any other industry has done, to be sensitive to issues around equity, is because this industry, the cannabis industry alone, up to this point, is the only one that essentially emerged from a period of total criminalization. Right? What else? Where else do you have a market that was entirely criminalized and that evolves to one of total legalization? Right? I mean, the only thing I can think about is alcohol prohibition. Right? The 14 years of alcohol prohibition, but that was only 14 years, at which point we just re-legalized a substance that had been legal 14 years before. There's something special going on here. Now, obviously, if psychedelics is going to emerge in a similar way, it too, even though there were not the millions going to jail and being arrested and all that, it too will have some obligation, understanding, to be different than other industry. It's not like somebody just created a transistor or a widget or a new technological development. It's not like some apple just fell off a tree and somebody figured it out. These things have a rich history, and part of that history is the history of oppression. Now, when I go and speak, it's oftentimes about linking what's going on in the psychedelics field with the broader drug policy reform movement. And on the one hand, it's about going and telling my allies in drug policy reform, the ones who are still trying to roll back the war on drugs, who are still trying to deal with a massive overdose crisis which killed 100,000 people last year, mostly with an unregulated substance, fentanyl, black market fentanyl, right? Killing more people than all the gun victims and all the automobile victims and everything else put together, right? But they're working on that. They're working on the continuing fact that we have hundreds of thousands of nonviolent offenders behind bars on drug charges. We're talking about the fact that gangsters are controlling this business and corrupting governments around the world still because of the illegality and criminality of all these drugs. And it's not to say that the answer with all drugs is to legalize all drugs, but it is to say that with all drugs, there is an obligation to end the criminalization of simple possession. That core idea that nobody should be going to jail for simply possessing any drug for your own use. Now I'm coming in here to an issue and a struggle of what I oftentimes talk to when I speak to psychedelics audiences. If I'm saying to the drug policy reform, my allies, don't ignore what's going on in psychedelics. This is important. And the simple fact that there's not a major racial justice dimension to psychedelics, there is some, doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to it or that there's not many people behind bars. But when I go to psychedelics audience, I talk to something else. There's this phenomenon called psychedelics exceptionalism. Psychedelics exceptionalism. It's that tendency to think that our drugs, they're the good ones. And those other ones, well, whatever happens to people dealing with that has absolutely nothing to it. People selling fentanyl, selling cocaine, selling meth, nothing to do with us. Well, look, let me be frank. I am a psychedelic exceptionalist. I am a marijuana and psychedelic exceptionalist. And I say that for two reasons. One, because in my own personal life, those are the two substances which have been very good friends to me for many decades. I've relished my cannabis and psychedelic use. I would not want to look back on my life and think, oh my God, what if those things had never existed? Or look forward and think that I would never have the opportunity to do those things again. And because I know, and the other drugs, interesting, I've tried them, this and that, but they've not been special for me in that way. And then, of course, the second fact is that when you look from a sort of broader cost-benefit perspective about these drugs, the upside of cannabis and psychedelics compared to the downside is overwhelming, notwithstanding the harms that happen, notwithstanding the abuses, notwithstanding the kids who are waking and baking and screwing up in school, notwithstanding the 10% of all cannabis users who really have a problem with it, get addicted and dependent and all this sort of stuff, notwithstanding the problems that have happened with people who flipped out on psychedelics and jumped off porches and buildings, and people who are susceptible to mental illness and had that break from which they never came back. We know these things are not, they may be godsends, but they're not perfect for everybody. But the benefit-cost ratio is so enormous with these substances. Whereas when you look at the opioids, when you look at cocaine, amphetamine, a range of others, nicotine, alcohol, it's much more mixed. All of those substances also have an upside to them. Let's remember, opium, the opiates, that has been the universal, pain relief medicine for zillions of people throughout history, going back thousands of years, from ordinary people struggling with chronic or acute pain to people on battlefield wounds, you name it. Cocaine. Coca in its more original form has played a big positive role among the indigenous peoples in the Andes, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia. But cocaine, although it had its medical aspects, we also know what happened with that. Amphetamine, stimulants have a significant upside to them, but also that downside. But here's the thing. Just because I am, and I presume most of us are, psychedelic and cannabis exceptionalists, doesn't mean that we ignore all the rest of this. That's separationism. It's just not morally acceptable. And I'll tell you why. Because ultimately, there's a core principle underlying sensible, pragmatic drug policy, ethical drug policy. And it's this, that nobody deserves to be punished for what we put in our bodies, absent harm to others. Nobody deserves to be punished or discriminated against or amongst based upon what we put in our bodies if we are not putting other people at major risk by getting behind the wheel of a car under the influence or actually going out and hurting other people. That core principle has to hold across all the substances. And it means as you move forward, you need to keep that principle in mind and not to keep thinking about when we look at what happened, what they did in Portugal 20 years ago, where they adopted a policy where nobody goes to jail for possession of any substance whatsoever, right? They may get arrested, but they don't go to jail for that. Or when Oregon passed a ballot initiative 2 years ago, they passed 2 ballot initiatives. One on psychedelics decrim and therapy, the one that was just replicated in Colorado with some other revisions just a few days ago. Hey, shout out to Colorado here. But there was another ballot initiative of probably even greater historical value, which was the adoption of the Portugal model in a state in the United States, a model that says that nobody should go to jail for simple possession of other drugs. If you're really a bad guy, we'll catch you for something else. And that's one that I can't imagine that anybody here should ever vote for one and vote against the other. Or vote to be pounding more resources into locking people up or pouring money down the drain at the borders in futile efforts to keep drugs from coming to this country, when instead we should put money into helping people who need help with drugs, and in money into keeping people from being in the conditions which might lead them to get in trouble with drugs, right? So that idea, that broader notion that, and if you think about it, it's analogous in a way. We think about psychedelics more than any other drug about our freedom of consciousness, right? Because of their power to alter our consciousness. And if you go back and you think about what's probably kept America straight and good for a very long period of time, all things considered, with all the sordid elements of our history, but still perhaps the longest, most surviving constitutional democracy in the world today. But the First Amendment, that freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly, right? And the thing about those amendments, they don't just apply to elevated and good speech, press, religion, and assembly. They also apply to the less elevated and to the despicable and to the hateful. Up to a point, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You can't assemble a mob. You can't commit human sacrifice as part of your freedom of religion. You can't libel. But up to a very good point, we go very far in tolerating not just the elevated speech, but oftentimes the more despicable speech, because we understand that once you give government the power to suppress those less elevated forms, you never know where a government or a future government will take that power in the future. And if you think about all of those key First Amendment freedoms, underlying them is a presumption of freedom of consciousness, right? In ways that the Founding Fathers could never have imagined that the freedom of consciousness would ever be under attack, could ever be at risk because of the emergence of drug testing or other ways of trying to control people, right? So that core principle, and it's the thing I appeal to all of you here, that as you're moving forward as individuals, as parents, as citizens, as business people, that you keep in mind that broader principle, that basic sense of kinship with these other substances. If you are going to make money from this psychedelics renaissance that's happening now, understand not just the origins of indigenous peoples, which is pivotal, but also understand as well the kinship with these other substances. Now, we have to beware, as Brad said before, this is not the first psychedelic renaissance. There was one in the 50s and 60s, and it got wiped out. And we can blame Timothy Leary for getting outrageous, and he deserves some blame for what he did. But even more so, we can blame Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon took advantage of the situation back then, right? And he basically was the one who, wanted to go after black and brown poor people by going after, heroin and marijuana. He wanted to go after the hippies and others by going after LSD and to some extent weed, right? But, that always lies ahead in a way. The fact that this Renaissance, we know the pendulum swings. We know that at some point, even with marijuana now legal in 21 states, and I think a lot of it's inevitable, but it's not as if the people who are afraid of this level of freedom and the availability of these substances aren't scared and don't carry moral views that are about trying to keep punishing people for what they put in their bodies, right? We know with the kids, got to watch out about the kids. It's not just about their safety, but about the ways in which the kid issue can be used against progress. For many, many years, the war on drugs was justified as one great big child protection act. Why can't we legalize marijuana for medical purposes? Protect the kids. Why can't we have needle exchange programs to reduce HIV/AIDS? To protect the kids. Why can't we reduce mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders? Because to protect the kids. Why can't we make methadone more available to heroin addicts who are struggling on the streets? To protect the kids. That bullshit line, to protect the kids, right? And I'll tell you something right now, one issue I've become very interested in is the whole one over vaping and juuling and tobacco harm reduction, right? Where in fact, the benefits, this is a technological breakthrough and innovation, which is actually an incredible advance for public health. I mean, if I could snap my fingers right now and all of the 35 million American smokers who can't quit were to switch to vaping or juuling or taking these oral pouches and stuff, it would be one of the greatest advances in public health in American history. If all of the billion one people around the world who are smoking tobacco were to switch to consuming it in non-combustible forms, right? It would be one of the greatest advances in global public health. But because a bunch of kids started juuling and vaping and their parents started flipping out about that a few years ago, and nobody wants teenagers vaping and juuling, but in fact the risks to those kids were minimal compared to the potential benefits to adults of making that switch. But what happened was the old sentiment, but what about the kids? Protect the kids, stood in the way of putting out the science that in fact this form of consuming nicotine is dramatically less dangerous than smoking it, that it's primarily the smoking and the burnt particle matter. I know I'm telling you many things that you haven't heard before, and you're probably looking at me and saying, what's he talking about? But it gets to that other point. I remember years ago going to a leadership group in Baltimore and talking to people there. And I said, how many of you support needle exchange programs to reduce HIV/AIDS? And most of them raised their hands. I said, how many of you did that when your brave mayor, Kurt Schmoke, in the late 80s, early 90s, first proposed it? And most hands went down. And I said, you realize in the time it took for you to get it, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans died unnecessarily because we didn't do the sort of pragmatic harm reduction approaches that other countries had done. And the point I made to them and I want to make here is that there is a cost to a slow learning curve. There's a cost to a slow learning curve. Speed it up, speed it up. I'm looking at another issue involving opioids, right? We know how reckless, you look at Big Pharma, Purdue Pharma, all of this, marketing their opioids and their OxyContins, for not just for acute pain, which was appropriate, but for chronic pain, right? And, it was part of what unleashed the overdose crisis in the early 21st century, right? Yet at the same time now we see a pendulum swinging back the other way, where the old problem of undertreating pain, where people are stripped off their opioid medications even though they're working successfully with them, right? Where doctors are refusing to take patients who are on opioid maintenance of any sort right now. And once again, we all go along with it, think it's a great thing. I love the fact that Purdue Pharma is flat against the wall and being sued up the gazoo. But at the same time, to swing that pendulum the other way, and it's important for you here, because with psychedelics, we have this renaissance going on now. And inevitably, there will be some of this swinging back. It's how we pursue this thing rationally, but part of your understanding about how to protect the future of psychedelics is understanding where your own learning curve is too short today. Where it's too short today. If you're going with the conventional wisdom about tobacco harm reduction and these e-cigarettes being the worst thing in the world, you're making a fundamental mistake of the same sort that stands in the way of greater advances in psychedelics. If you believe that nobody should be on opioids to manage their pain anymore, and you're telling relatives to get off their, then you are making the same mistake as others have. So be aware, to be conscious of this need, that it's not just this issue, it's a broader issue about how we deal with psychoactive drugs. Now, the frame I bring to this in the biggest way is the one of harm reduction and, to some extent, benefit maximization. I mean, let's face it, there's basically never been a drug-free society in human history. I mean, except maybe the, I guess we used to call them Eskimos, the Inuits, who couldn't grow anything, right? I mean, so they didn't have it. But I mean, almost every place else in the world, right? People figured out, they figured out alcohol 10,000 years ago. They figured out opium. They figured out coca. They figured out tobacco. I mean, all of these mushrooms, right? People starving, scavenging, and, they're finding some fungus over there. And, well, eat that one. Oops, that one just killed my brother. And oops, that one, wow, I saw God, right? I mean, it's an element of how we learn, since we cannot get rid of these psychoactive substances, is how do we learn how to live with them so they cause the least possible harm and the greatest possible good. That is always the challenge. And it is going to be the challenge in the psychedelics area as well. One of the things that's different today as opposed to 50 years ago is major research institutes, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, NYU Langone, University of California, Baylor, University College London, places in Brazil and Europe, all having well-funded psychedelic research centers because of the miraculous possibilities, the potential for what's happening in psychedelics to revolutionize psychiatry, right? Yet at the same time, we also know that that these things are going to continue to be used in quote-unquote recreational. In the same way when people say with marijuana, is it medical or non-medical? That's not the question. What we know with cannabis is that it's a spectrum from something that is purely medical to purely recreational and everything in between, right? I mean, is Viagra medical or non-medical? When you use weed to enjoy your sex life a little more, what is that there? When you use it to relax or enjoy something more, right? And with psychedelics, it's going to be the same thing. From the purely medical and psychotherapeutic to the purely recreational and the spiritual and everything in between there. We know that's going to open up possibilities, right, for marketing these things, for people who are going to find ways to use psychedelics, not just, for the 2 trips or the 4 trips or the 6 trips with a therapist, using MDMA or using psilocybin or maybe up the future Ibogaine or whatever, but also people are realizing that, that low-dose cannabis chocolates, wow. I was visiting a friend of mine, one of the speakers later today in New York, and he pulls out one of the marijuana delivery lists, and it wasn't just marijuana on that list. It was like 12 different types of mushrooms and different flavored chocolate bars and 2CB and MDMA and you name it. So there is a new world emerging. Now, the question, of course, of how the increasingly legal market relates to the illegal market, or what some people in cannabis call the legacy market, that's going to be on you too. Right? Because we know people spend a lot of money to develop and get approval from FDA and other things like that and to abide by regulations, but people are selling this stuff illicitly still or undercutting that market. And so you develop a tension. And then all of a sudden, all the people who fought to end prohibition now find themselves involved with a system, a psychedelics or drug regulatory system, which is going to involve punishing people who aren't obeying by the regulation. It's an inevitable built-in tension where we have to find what are the right lines, what are the right in-betweens. And in this way, I'll tell you, when it comes to cannabis, there's a special place in hell reserved for people in the cannabis industry who oppose the right of people to grow their own cannabis. I mean, no way to sum it up, but fucking despicable. I remember organizing a conference in London in 1998, the first ever conference on regulating cannabis back in 98. And I remember Jeffrey Guy from GW Pharmaceutical doing amazing, it shows up there. I'm saying, this guy's an ally. He's showing the medical benefits and, and doing good things in terms of showing how cannabis can be beneficial, THC, CBD, Sativex, Epidiolex, what have you. And some years later, I find out GW Pharmaceuticals hired a lobbyist in DC, a former deputy drug czar, a horrific drug warrior, to try to block the progress of medical marijuana legalization. I don't want to see that stuff. The piggish behavior in trying to grab patents, not just patents that are well-deserved, but patents that are not well-reserved because, it's just standard operating procedure, just business, right? No. And, I saw in Colorado now, what you have is and Oregon to some extent, especially Colorado, there's a decriminalization element. I actually think the folks who care just about their right to grow and use their own psychedelics are overly flipped out about all the psychedelic medicine and psychedelic therapy going on. Because I think all that psychedelic therapy is just going to land up destigmatizing psychedelics more broadly, right? But at the same time, I never want to see something happen where those who are advocating for psychedelics legalization and medicine and investing in that ever advocate that people should go to prison or be jailed or harmed for growing their own mushrooms or finding their own products. So it's an honor for me to be here with all of you today. I am very excited. I have to tell you that Brad put together an amazing program. I've been to a few of these events, and you are in for a real treat today. And I'm just asking all of you, as you move forward, as you hopefully flourish and survive, keep in mind, be a psychedelic exceptionalist in your heart and in your own way, but understand that you are part of a broader movement for drug policy reform grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. Thank you.